Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Tawney lecture. This is my final opportunity to choose someone I wanted to hear during the period of my presidency, and I'm delighted that I was able to get our speaker, Jane Humphries, to take on this job. Before I go any further, can I just ask you to turn off mobile phones if you've got them on? I first met Jane, I was just checking up a moment ago, oddly enough, in the depths of the rural Mexican countryside at a conference in Ixtapan de la Sal that was being run by the American Social Science Research Council, involving some pretty stuffy demographers and development economists, and this sort of fireball, this young fireball, came and really sort of, I think, changed the nature of the occasion fundamentally. I followed her career thereafter with great interest and growing admiration. Those of you who perhaps come from a more conventional historical background may not realize that Jane manages to bridge the divide between, if you like, sort of mainstream development economics and growth and development and labour market work with a very formidable reputation as an interpreter of the British Industrial Revolution. But all her work, I think, has what I regard as a humane quality to it, which I think will come out in what we're going to hear this morning. She's published extensively on issues to do with gender, the family, the history of women's work, and of course, right at the core of her work is the relationship between the family and the economy in the past and in a variety of contemporary contexts. Currently, she has an ESRC professorial fellowship in which she's working on the Industrial Revolution and the household economy in Britain between 1700 and 1878. But I think what we're going to hear in the Tawney lecture is something from the fruits of that book that is soon to be published on childhood and child labour in the British Industrial Revolution. And there are some flyers about that, which I'm sure Jane would be very pleased if you were to take away. But without further ado, I'm going to ask Jane to give us the Tawney lecture on childhood and child labour in the British Industrial Revolution.
Oh, alas, my fireball days are over. Well, this morning I'm going to begin with some voices.
It is told of the younger Pitt that, in looking around for more earners and still more to meet the demands for more money and still more to carry on the war with Napoleon, the great statesman says, "We must yoke up the children to work in the factories." I cannot vouch for the story, but in 1831, when between 7 and 8, I found myself with many children of the same age, standing at the spinning frames, 13 hours a day, 5 days a week, and 11 on Saturday.
When I was 6 years and 2 months old, I was sent off to work. Fancy that, only just 6 years of age. This was at the end of February or early March, and I do not think I shall ever forget those long and hungry days in the fields. My work was about a mile from home, and I had for wages 18 pence a week and my dinner on Sundays. The dinner they gave me made the Sunday the greatest and happiest day of the week. When the barley was up and the scaring of crowds was unnecessary, I had to mind a flock of 100 sheep. The sense of loneliness and responsibility frequently overcame me, and in a desperation I would shout, "Mother, mother, mother." But mother could not hear. She was away that time, working in the hayfield 2 miles away. Then I had the job of minding about 40 pigs. Pigs are very different animals to mind from sheep. Sheep will keep together. Every pig will go its own careless on its own way, careless of the others, the worry, the trouble, the running to and fro.
Until I was 7 years old, I lived partly with my father and grandmother, and partly in Horton Workhouse. I was then bound apprentice to a man. He turned me over to the colliers in Denholm, on which my father said to him, "I'd rather you tied a stone around his neck and drowned him." I was a fine, growing, active lad at that time. I saw some cripples in the house of my new master, and the thought came across me that I was to share the same fate with them. At first I was taught to spin worsted, but it was not long before I was taken to the coal pit. After working hard all day, I had to go 2 or 3 miles with picks to be sharpened or to spin at home till bedtime.
In the winter of 1844, it was found necessary that my brother, John, and I should go to the pits. We had neither food nor shoes nor light in our first shift. The wagon man, Tommy Dixon by name, visited me and cheered me on through a gloomy night. When I wept for my mother, he sang that nice little hymn. "In darkest shades it thou appear, my dawning has begun." And he brought me some cake and a candle.
After the death of my mother, my brother was pressed on board a man-of-war. I felt myself alone in the wide world, but the spirits of childhood are buoyant and elastic, and I was naturally a wild dog, of an active and unconquerable spirit. I was playing marbles in a lane called Love Lane, and was in the very act of having a shot at the whole ring with my blood alley. The shrill notes of a fife and the hollow sound of a distant drum struck on my active ear. It was a recruiting party of the Royal Artillery. The fifer very little exceeded that of the drum by which he stood. Surely, I thought to myself, sidling up to him, I must be myself as tall, if not taller, than this little blade, and should make as good a soldier. I swallowed the recruiting sergeant's speech whole. It was all about gentlemen soldiers, merry life, muskets rattling, cannons roaring, drums beating, colours flying, regiments charging, and shouts of "Victory! Victory!" I raised myself on tiptoe to appear as tall as possible, strutted up to the sergeant, and asked him in plain words if he would take I for a sodger.
And it wasn't all sharp when he got there. Croce's adage that all history is contemporary history, and historians are constantly interpreting and reinterpreting the past through the lens of their current anxieties and their own view of the world, is very well illustrated by the historiography of the Industrial Revolution, as Canadine told us in his classical article in 1984. The classic accounts of the early 20th century emphasized poverty, inequality, and negative externalities. Child labour and childhood, our topics here today, were a key aspect of these classic accounts and depicted as playing a key role in the Industrial Revolution. But interwar economic historians reinterpreted the Industrial Revolution from a perspective dominated by the economics of cycles and recession. And in the optimistic years after World War II, economic historians looked back and saw the Industrial Revolution as a takeoff into self-sustained growth, concerned with leading sectors of cotton and iron, and sudden shifts in investment rates. And searched in this account with the spectacles provided by development economics for lessons for contemporary third world countries. The end of the Golden Age and the development and the failures of development economics and stagflation produced a new macroeconomic perspective that emphasized slow change, long routes, early development, and the retention of traditional labor-intensive production methods. Canadine's survey ended in 1984, but perhaps we can bring it up to date. Recent interpretations, for instance, have looked at institutions and seen how institutions drive growth and structural change. Anxieties about resource constraints and environmentalism have prompted a view of the Industrial Revolution that sees it as an escape from the organic economy. Late 20th century concerns with consumerism have prompted looking back at the Industrial Revolution in terms of its relative prosperity and consumerism. And finally, and this echoes last year's Tawney, of course, technological innovations of our own time have found resonance in reinterpretations that underscore the scientific advances of the era and their application to production, and the way in which factor endowments and other conditions might prove as prompts for innovation. These successive interpretations and reinterpretations have pushed child labour further and further away from centre stage to the margins of an account of the British Industrial Revolution. The current conventional wisdom downplays the importance of the cotton industry, of factories, of machineries, and of poverty, all of which were linked to child labour in those classic accounts I mentioned a moment ago. So the modern interpretations then minimise the potential role and importance of child labour. It disappears from our vision of this key time in the past. However, current anxieties perhaps should turn our attention back towards childhood and where and how children fit into society. You can't open a newspaper in modern Britain without seeing accounts of broken Britain and how children, in fact, and families are at the core of this fragmentation. And it's not simply that children are the victims here. We are all increasingly afraid of our children, of how they might have developed in ways that we find uncomfortable. Whether this be the hoodies that hang out outside your local convenience store, or if you drove up here up the A1 as I did, you would pass Edlington, where in fact hellboys live who appear to have become feral as a result of parental and community and social neglect. Moreover, it's not simply current anxieties, but there are backwaters and eddies in our discipline where people still have worked on child labour in the Industrial Revolution and on childhood. And there's been recent research. Several people in this room have contributed to this work, looking at child labour in this time period. And these recent research has produced some new and interesting findings, particularly that child labour is important beyond the mills and mines that featured so heavily in those classic accounts, and is in fact ubiquitous in traditional industries and the small-scale production units. But the modern work has also emphasised that child labour was of strategic importance in the early factories, and particularly when those factories were operated in isolated rural mills and dependent on water power. And recently there's been an emphasis again on the role of pauper apprentices in these early factories. But the recent work remains rather unclear about the chronology of child labour and lacks serious quantitative underpinnings, and that's to do with the difficulties with the data, as Peter Kirby, for instance, has emphasised in his recent monograph. And also, the story about child labour has lost touch with the mainstream account of the Industrial Revolution. But is there possibilities here then for a synthesis? Can we reintegrate these recent accounts of child labour back with the modern interpretations of the Industrial Revolution? And here I want to think about where there might be space to fit children back in. And the first point I want to make, and I'm glad to see Nick Harley's here because he taught me this point, is that although modern accounts have de-emphasised the role of the cotton sector and factory industry, it continues still as an important component of British industrialisation. In addition, recent accounts of the Industrial Revolution have emphasized the ongoing importance of Smithian growth. And we might well be able to fit children into an industrial revolution where divisions of labor, the persistence of small-scale production, and specialization are important elements. And finally, although recent interpretations have emphasized that Britain was a high-wage economy, a rich economy in comparison to Europe, and certainly rich in comparison to its own past, there are some little hooks where we might suggest that not everybody shared in this prosperity. My colleague Bob Allen has elegantly called the pause of British real wages in the 1770s through to 1850 Engels' pause. There are also occupational groups which are left out of this account of prosperity. For instance, agricultural labourers, we know their wages were stagnant through the time period. And of course, we could talk about de-skilled components of the occupational structure, like handloom weavers. And we can also refer to families, for instance, that lacked male heads. So a judicious reading, then, of these new views might leave space for children's work as a characteristic of the Industrial Revolution. But my argument goes further, and it claims that child labour was extended and intensified and remains an essential feature of the newly conceptualised Industrial Revolution. Well, my sources. Well, you've already heard from some of my sources. I've read more than 600 working-class autobiographies from the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, and I've used this to create a database of working-class experience that can then be analysed systematically. No time to go into this today, but this material has been checked to ensure that the working-class autobiographers were, in fact, representative, both economically and demographically. And there's one exception there, which I will come back to. There's one way in which they are demographically perhaps not representative, and that's going to be an issue that I pick up on later on. And this material extracted from the working class autobiographies supports both a quantitative and qualitative analysis. Here's a pretty picture that shows one of my rather more attractive working class autobiographies. As you see, this is a manuscript one. It's even decorated with a little picture in the top left-hand corner. This is Henry Price's picture of how, in fact, the workhouse in which he was incarcerated as a child changed in the transition from the old to the new poor law. So a very evocative document here. What are my findings from the autobiographies? Well, my findings are that there is an upsurge of child labour in that classic period of the Industrial Revolution from late 18th century, early 19th century. This upsurge in participation rates is associated with younger working. Here's a cumulative frequency distribution of age at starting work, which is an almost universally recorded aspect of a life story. And you can see here those middle two cohorts, the green cohort and the beige cohort. You can see that they're characterized by earlier working. And the period after 1850, you can see that at that point in time, that earlier working is beginning to fade away. But perhaps even more interesting, the period before the Industrial Revolution, which in the case of the autobiographies runs from 1627 through to 1790, that's also perhaps associated with less frequency of very young working. Age at starting work is related to the time period that we're looking at in a U-shaped relationship. in the sample as a whole, and this is replicated if we stratify the sample by, in fact, father's occupational group. You see over and over again there in this picture that little U-shaped curve showing the drop in the age at which children started work in the Industrial Revolution period in those two middle cohorts from 1791 through to 1850. But although we see this U-shaped relationship replicated, you can see that the inter-group differences in age at starting work dominate the intra-group differences, so that the children, for instance, of tradesmen and of fathers who worked in the service sector start work later than do agricultural labourers' children, for example, in all time periods, just about. And certainly start work later than do the children of casual workers or soldiers in the time period that we're looking at. But the ranking of these occupational groups is not static over time. Shifts in the occupational hierarchy are detectable in the relative ages at which sons began to work. So domestic manufacturers, for example, were once part of the working class elite, but de-skilling associated with this more detailed division of labour and competition for factory-produced goods wore down their living standards. And you can see in the bar chart there that their sons experienced a dramatic decline in age at starting work in the second cohort, consistent with this loss of economic status. And you can see that soldiers' sons, too, in the first and second cohorts, started work later than did the sons of casual workers. But this advantage looks to have been eroded as soldiers' relative pay deteriorated. In the contrast, that with seamen's sons, sailors' apparent ability to support dependent children through this period reflects the effects of the French and Napoleonic Wars, which drove sailors' wages to extraordinary levels, as Davis, for instance, documented in his classic account. So I think these findings are in contrast to Kirby's suggestion, for instance, that very young working was never widespread in the British economy. The rise in child participation rates in the late 1700s and early 1800s was associated necessarily with younger working. And if very young working is interpreted as working under the age of 10, this was far from rare. In the cohorts that lived through the Industrial Revolution, the sons of miners, factory workers, outworkers, casual workers, and soldiers all on average started work before age 10. Moreover, the evidence is in line with recent research that suggests that child labour was endemic through the British economy. Widespread in traditional industries and in services and agriculture, as well as in newly mechanising sectors. This is, sorry Peter, this is from your book again here. This is Peter's top 20 jobs as he extracted them from the census. And then on the left-hand column are the 20 most frequently recorded first jobs in the autobiographies. And you can see that these match up really rather well, suggesting, again, confidence in the representative nature of the autobiographical material. But this table also shows you how widespread children's work was, that it wasn't just in the mills and mines of the classical accounts, but it spread through the service sector that Tawney, Wrigley and Lee Shaw Taylor have now shown to be quite robust and buoyant through the Industrial Revolution period. So we find children very important as messengers, as porters, spreading into the commercial sector. So children are important as office boys. Of course, children are important in the services sector in terms of traditional services like domestic servant. Well, it's hardly surprising that agriculture, small-scale manufacturing and services should provide the majority of jobs for children. After all, as the new view of the Industrial Revolution emphasises, these sectors, along with customary methods of production, dominated the developing economy, with factories and mechanisations, but islands of modernity until well on into the 19th century. So ironically, the recognition of child labour's importance in traditional employments has coincided with a new appreciation for the role of agriculture, small-scale manufacturing, and services in industrialization, and so perhaps helps to restore child labor to the center of the economic stage. But although the autobiographical evidence concurs with other recent findings in recognizing the extent of children's employment in these traditional sectors of the economy, it assigns a strategic role to their work in factories. The novelty of large-scale mechanized production units meant that they could not absorb the majority of child workers, but it also meant that they lacked an established labor force, and therefore the recruitment of children was essential if they were in fact to expand. Katrina Honeyman, in her recent excellent book, makes the same point in relation particularly to pauper apprentices. But the autobiographers also suggest that free child workers, born in the classic era of industrialization, constituted an important component of early factory labor, growing up to become a permanent workforce. And you can see this. This is Father's First Jobs by broad occupational group and cohort. And you can see here a very small wedge of beige in those first two stacks, the first two cohorts, showing that fathers were very rarely found in factory jobs in those first two time periods that I looked at. But if we turn to first jobs of sons, then you can see here an explosion of that wodge of beige there, showing how important children's jobs were in factories in the period, particularly in that period, 1791 through 1800. So you can see there the vital importance of child labour in the early factories and the vital importance of the expansion of child labour to support factory employment. And we can trace this down also, drilling down into the autobiographical data, we can trace this to stories of individuals. Remember Robert Collier, who you heard as you very first entered this room, who was reminiscing about the long hours he worked in the textile factory in which he was employed. Well, Collier's father was actually the son of a sailor in Nelson's fleet, who drowned at sea. The family were orphaned, and so they were taken from a London workhouse. Collier's father was taken from a London workhouse to a textile factory in Fewston. And his mother, similarly, was the child of a sailor who was also lost at sea, although his home port was Norwich. The mother and father then met in the apprentice house in this factory, and eventually married, and Robert and his brothers were the offspring of this union. The father trained as a blacksmith and subsequently was re-employed in the factory for 32 years. So Robert Collier tells this story. He says, "We don't really have a family tree, we only have this low bush because I cannot trace my parents back further than this generation." And I don't think Niels is here because we heard earlier in this conference about the binding of chimney sweeps. But here's how Robert Collier describes the account his father gave him of how he was recruited from that London workhouse and taken to work in Fewston. And he says, "They gave me free choice of whether or not to stay or go. But I decided to be a bound apprentice." And he says, "And I went not knowing where I was going and what was going to happen to me." But this is a story that is replicated several times in the autobiographies and shows the role and importance of children in the creation of this factory labour force. Well, is it possible to see these findings in terms of a labour market then for child labour, which is firmly located in our new view of the Industrial Revolution? Now I want to try and put these findings about child labour, and they're quite consistent with other people's work on child labour in recent times too. I want to put that back into the new stories of the Industrial Revolution, the new interpretations of the Industrial Revolution. And to do this, I'm going to use a model from development economics. Traditionally, the Tawney lecture has a model in it, so at least one hard picture. So here's my model. This is a model that I've adopted from development economics. It's based on two axioms, two very easily accepted axioms, I think. The first is that adult labor is a substitute for child labor. This really is all that this gets rid of is this idea of children having nimble fingers and adults not being able to substitute for children, although, of course, you would need to have an adult equivalency correction. And the luxury axiom. And the luxury axiom asserts that households send their children to work only when driven to do so by poverty. Children's non-work or attendance at school is a luxury good. Households whose adult incomes are very low cannot afford to keep children out of some productive activity. It's only when adult incomes begin to rise are children withdrawn from the labour force. Implicit in this account is the idea that parents are altruistic. This is the details of the model. Assume for simplicity the household consists only of the economy consists only of n households, and that each household has an adult and some children in it. We need to correct if an adult provides 1 unit of labour, then a child will provide gamma times 1. Well, gamma is a positive fraction. And in equilibrium, in fact, pay will be proportional to that equivalency relationship. So each household then decides on the minimum acceptable level of consumption. We can call this subsistence consumption, although it may have an element, a historical element of achieved standard of living. Adults are assumed to work full time. Only if income nonetheless falls below a subsistence consumption level are children sent to work, as assumed in the luxury axiom. And this is the picture that relates to those assumptions. So you can see here that if wages are on the vertical axis, if wages are above subsistence level S, then the only labour that's provided is the adult labour at N. As wages fall below S, households provide children to the labour market. The particular shape of that section BC depends on specific assumptions that we might make here. The specific assumption I've made is that households have a target income, and therefore that's a rectangular hyperbola, but that's just a detail. You can get that relationship through a number of assumptions. The key item here is, in fact, that we get a backward-bending section of the supply curve out of this interaction between the luxury axiom and the substitution axiom. And once we've done that, you can see that if you then confront your backward-bending supply curve with a normal downward-sloping demand for labour, and it's for labour in terms of units of labour, adult labour or child labour, then in fact you've immediately got a possibility of multiple equilibria as depicted in the story here. And you can see that there are two stable equilibria, E1 and E2. E3 is an unstable equilibrium and then therefore not of much interest because the demand curve is intersecting the supply curve from above there. So what we're really interested in then is the two equilibria identified here. The first one you can see is the equilibrium when wages are above S, and that's an equilibrium with no child labour, and I'm rather pejoratively going to call that the good equilibria. And there's also an equilibrium where there is everybody's working, all the adults are working, and all the children are working, and that's a bad equilibrium. That's the equilibrium with child labour. Well, this model is usually used by development economists to tell a story about the disappearance of child labour, why child labour disappears as economies advance and become richer and more successful. And we can think about this in terms of the productivity of children. If as an economy develops, and the usual story here is to do with technology, and particularly the example that's often cited is computers, so that in fact computers and technology mean that child labour is less productive. So gamma, in fact, declines. Children become less able to provide or only provide smaller and smaller proportions of an efficiency unit of labour. And what that would do would be move that CF section to, in fact, the left-hand side. And so we get a movement of that little bit of the supply curve. And of course, you can see that what that does is it eliminates the bad equilibrium with child labour, because it moves us back to our unstable equilibrium, and the economy will then power out of E3, that unstable equilibrium, to the equilibrium with no child labour. So this is a kind of happy story. All we need is the right technology, doing away with any productivity contribution for children, and the bad equilibrium will disappear. But if you're not prepared to wait for that, and many development economists are not, then in fact we can get immediately to the good equilibrium with no child labour simply by banning child labour. And the interesting thing about this is, of course, that this means that it's a benign intervention, because once you've done it, you could then remove the ban on child labour, because wages are sufficiently high that at that wage rate, nobody would send their children to work anyway. So what the ban on child labour does is it overcomes the problems that families have in ensuring that nobody sends their children to work. So that ban on child labour, as Basu and Zanatos describe it, is in fact a benign intervention that will drive us towards the good equilibrium with no child labour, but is then unnecessary. We can remove it, and the economy will remain at that good situation. Yes, but of course, the same picture can be used to illustrate bad events that can create equilibria with child labour in economies where hitherto they have not existed, or in fact drive us to those bad equilibria. So if we can imagine certain situations whereby children are becoming more productive relative to adults, then this would in fact be shifting our supply curve in the way I just showed, and creating in our economy new equilibria characterised by child labour. Furthermore, if the economy is becoming deregulated, nothing will then hold the economy at E1, at the equilibrium, in fact, without child labour. E1 really represents a coordination failure, because working households would prefer to be at E1 with high wages, and they could be there if nobody sent their children to work. But the fact that there's no way of ensuring and credibly committing to not sending your children to work means that you can slip away from that good equilibrium. And if there are no institutions that are holding you there, such as the ban on child labour, such as protective labour legislation, and we can think of some other institutions that might have held an economy at the equilibrium with no child labour, such as guild regulations, early trade union activities, even social norms, provided they are vigorous and widespread enough, would have been able to hold our economy at E1. But without these, then we can in fact see deregulation could actually drive the economy to the bad equilibrium that's being created as a result of improvements in child productivity or increases in child productivity. Well, so much for theory. Let's think how this might help us understand the history. Well, the classic accounts, of course, lay great emphasis on mechanisation. And the emphasis is on mechanisation in textile factories, which the Webbs and the Hammonds and Marx himself, of course, saw as driving the employment of children. And in the autobiographical accounts, there are many examples of mechanisation being associated with early working of children. Here's J.R. Klein's account of his experience of textile factory and the equipment. But mechanisation has a great hold, I think, on the hearts and minds of economic historians. But when I looked into the experiences of early work, it's actually only a small part of what is driving children's labour. Partial mechanisation, for example, is another dimension of this story. And this is where part of the labour process is mechanised, and that makes a job for children. And here's a classic example of this, with Robert Dollar saying, in those days there were no self-feeding lathes, so this created a job for children to actually feed the partially mechanised lathes. But even more important than mechanisation and partial mechanisation in this account is the more detailed division of labour, which in trade after trade after trade is making children more productive. As jobs are divided up and segmented, there is in fact more and more space for children to work. And in fact, my finding here is echoes work done by Claudia Goldin and Ken Sokoloff on the northeast of the United States, where they argue that the division of labour in workshop manufacturing is more important in creating space for women and children workers than, in fact, mechanisation itself. And here I've provided, the obvious example, there are many examples here, and I've tried to get away from the obvious ones to suggest one in saddle making. And this is Frank Galton's description of his father's trade being de-skilled then and taken away from skilled adult males by the subdivision of labour. He says, springing up were these large workshops where saddles were being made by subdivided labour, and boys and girls were being introduced into these de-skilled bits of the labour process. Another way in which children were becoming more productive, more useful in these new, more detailed divisions of labour was in moving finished goods and work in progress and raw materials around the workplace, a massive increase in the need for transport workers that we often forget when we talk about Smithian growth. And children were perfect workers to use in these new demands for transportation within firms and outside firms. And a very good example here is mining, where as, in fact, seams get longer, deeper, more and more transport workers are needed, and children provide a very useful source of this kind of labour. So what I'm suggesting here is that Smithian growth is associated with new space for children in the production process and very, very important space for them in transporting materials around. Well, all this is about how the equilibrium a new equilibria associated with child labour may be being conjured into existence by children becoming more productive in these new types of labour processes. But what is going to drive the economy to this equilibrium with child labour? And remember, here we have to see deregulation happening in the economy. Well, of course, there is no effective ban on child labour. There's no effective protective labour legislation in this time period. The first, even marginally protective labour legislation isn't until 1833. We could argue that the decay of guild controls, in fact, is also deregulating the child labour market. The repeal of statutory apprenticeship, I would argue, is also deregulating the child labour market. The Combination Acts, blows against trade unionism, are creating a more deregulated child labour market. Hammond's chapter on child labour immediately follows their chapter on the Combination Acts, and they say this is part and parcel of the same deregulation of the labour market. And an increasingly punitive poor law, and I think Peter Kirby has emphasised this in his work too, is also creating deregulation in the child labour market, as poor relief is conditional, in fact, on everybody helping themselves, doing the best for their families. Children are drawn into that, and child labour becomes more socially acceptable. So here's our master shoemaker describes the impact that deregulation has in his trade, driving the trade towards that bad equilibrium with child labour. He says factory acts and school boards didn't exist in those times. And so what we see here is women and children were being compelled to do men's labour, and the equipment is being redesigned around the use of this kind of labour, and as a result prices are falling. More and more families are therefore trapped in this vicious cycle with the adult wages falling and the need to add children and women workers in order to maintain family subsistence. Well, the final nail in driving the economy towards the bad equilibrium, I'm going to call competitive dependence. And this follows a very nice paper by Dupke and Zilibotti in the AER, where they use a similar term to describe this kind of dynamic. The argument here is that children were competitive in labour markets, but they are contributors in families. And that's what underpins that failure of commitment around the good equilibrium. Because the problem is here that as adult male workers' wages fall, for any reason whatsoever, the solution will be to add workers, and the added workers, added child workers, then represent that coordination failure as we slip away from the good equilibrium and eventually zigzag down, catapult down to the bad equilibrium. Frank Galton, when we heard about his father's trade of saddler losing its skilled status and wages in that trade falling, and the saddlers' union unable to shore up the opposition to child workers, Galton himself is sent to work at a young age. He's sent to work aged 11. That's young for the 1860s, which is when this story is taking place. But he doesn't actually get work as a saddler, so he's not helping to drive down his own father's wages. But in very many trades, competitive dependence of this pure kind is encountered, with children actually participating in reducing the wages of their own parents, their own fathers. And you might remember little Arnold, who you encountered, young Arnold there, who you encountered with his pigs and his sheep as you first came into the room. And eventually, William Arnold becomes a sprigging boy in his father's trade of shoemaker. But the way he describes it here is he's not, of course, being introduced as a skilled worker in the method of making shoes that his father had been apprenticed in and trained in. Instead, it's a very de-skilled labour process. But as William Arnold becomes a sprigging boy and this new method of making shoes develops, in fact, the price of shoes declines and his father becomes less and less able to support the family. And the cycle of competitive dependence is manifest even at the micro level of this one family. Well, now I want to suggest some reasons why, background reasons that might be driving the economy to the bad equilibrium. And I'm going to really stick my neck out here, and this is running against one strong theme of the modern interpretations of the Industrial Revolution, and this is the theme that standard of living really was improving. And I'm going to begin by discussing the inadequacy of male earnings to support many of these families. The first part of this story is this top slicing of male earnings to finance tobacco and alcohol. I think Beatrice Mooring talked about this earlier on in the conference. It's manifest in very many autobiographies. Will Thorne, who's one of my autobiographers, who some of you may have heard of, a trade union leader, and eventually a member of parliament. Will Thorne describes his father, for instance, as drinking and fighting and spending a lot of his wages in the pub, even though the family is in very grave poverty. But he does this not in a judgmental way. He's not, he says drinking and fighting were his only diversions. So he's actually forgiving of his father for the top slicing that's going on. And many, many families were. De-skilling, another reason why male wages may have been inadequate. Engels' pause, so this is the failure of real wages to continue to go up from the 1770s through the 1820s. And this is manifest in many wage series, and particularly in Bob Allen's adjudication between Greg Clark and Charles Feinstein's real wage series for this time period. But even if average wages are going up, we know that there are many occupations, and very large occupations, in which wages have stagnated, wages have fallen behind. And an example here would be that largest of all occupations, agricultural laborers. And of course, these are not families where there are stationary and small numbers of children. This is a very rapidly growing population. The dependency ratio is becoming ever more burdensome in these households. So many fathers have to support large numbers of children. And there's also, this is not a fully employed economy, as we've heard in several sessions in the course of the conference. I don't have time to do this, but I could go through providing examples from the autobiographies of each one of these reasons. Here's just one story that pulls some of these reasons why male wages are inadequate together. This is Bill H. He's an anonymous autobiographer born in 1820. And his household economy is perhaps more representative than the gardener that Bob Allen talked about in last year's Tawney lecture, the London gardener, who was fortunate enough to have only 4 children and to earn a very, very substantial wage for a member of the primary producer, a gardener. And Bill H. says, my dad earned 7 shillings to 9 shillings. That was when he was fully employed. Unemployment was endemic. And he says also that 11 children were born into this family, although he laconically adds, we died down to 6. But even more important to my theme, another reason, another shock, if you want, to male wages is the large numbers of families which don't have a father, even one who can earning inadequate wages. First reason for this is mortality. The fathers of 18% of children in this time period would die before the children were age 14. We know this whether we march children through life tables or whether we do that more elegantly by simulating the data, or we can even look at those 1 or 2 well-kept parish registers where we can actually do a longitudinal analysis. So this is a mortality story. But, and remember I said at the very beginning of this lecture, that there's one way in which my sample look like they're not representative demographically. And that is that more children report a father's death than is consistent with the mortality estimate that I just told you about. And that's the only way in which these households are not demographically representative. And I've interpreted that as autobiographers reporting their fathers dead when their fathers have disappeared, are missing, either before or marriage, have gone, have deserted the families. In addition, desertion is acknowledged in another 8% of cases. So another 8% of boys report openly, my father never married my mother, or my father, I'm illegitimate, or my father buggered off. And in addition, there's dereliction. So there are some fathers who stayed, but who are not able or willing to be able to support their household. So the result of this is maybe 1/3 of children grew up in families without fathers. 1/3 of children. Well, you might be thinking, why such a frequency of broken families? Well, let's think about our time period, and let's think of some of these new interpretations of the Industrial Revolution. And so my first point here is an ironic one. I know historians love irony, so this should cheer you up with 5 minutes before your lunch, 10 minutes before your lunch. Industriousness is actually a force breaking families up. Because as fathers have to work longer hours, as they're in fact working away from home, they get separated from their families. And even if the best of intentions are there, sometimes those separations become permanent. Francis Place's father, some of you may remember, was actually an apprentice in a parish miles away from where the mother and young Francis lived. And there are many, many cases of fathers who are away from their families, building railways, digging canals, etc. Here we've got a lovely example of industriousness gone wrong. The journeyman baker's father went off in search of higher wages, but somehow he managed to get shipwrecked. But then, alas, he took to dram drinking, and all the remittances ceased. And the journeyman baker's wife was forced to disperse her children amongst various relatives and find them useful things to do and so on. But there's another exogenous shock to our industrializing economy here. Because, and Tony Wrigley raised this in his discussion yesterday, Britain is at war or preparing for war for roughly half of the long 18th century. And this is a war which involves mass mobilization. So, in fact, the Army and the Navy are recruiting between 10 and 14% of the male workforce aged between 15 and 40 by the end of the century. There's a lovely paper by somebody called Greenwood in the Royal Statistical Society which demonstrates, actually, that the loss of life in the Napoleonic Wars is proportionally greater than in World War I. So a lot of these men are not coming back from the French wars. Army and Navy pay seldom trickles back to the families dependent on these men. I've got a very nice example, Thomas Sanderson in the database, whose family is forced to eat acorns when his father's military pay doesn't reach them. And men who did come home were often disabled or simply unable to adjust to civilian life. Remember John Shipp, he who volunteers, swallows the recruiting sergeant's message whole? What that extract didn't tell you is that he's alone in the wide world because his father is a soldier who's killed in the French wars. His brother is then pressed on board a man-of-war, and that's why John finds himself as a poor law boy volunteering for one of those poor law regiments that we've actually now forgotten about, but which we sent off to fight Napoleon. Post-war trauma here. We'd call this post-traumatic stress disorder today, but John James Beeze's father, he loses an eye in the Napoleonic Wars and he has a small pension. The result of that is he drinks himself silly on pension day and beats the family up. Eventually, Beeze Sr. is incarcerated in Greenwich Hospital, which leaves the family dependent on poor relief. And here's back to the conditionality of poor relief prompting child labour, because at this point, the poor relief is made conditional on, in fact, John James himself being employed. Well, there is a bit of an elephant in the room here, because many of you might have been thinking, well, why is it the children that are working? Why isn't it the mothers that are working? And here, what I have to say has to be very much foreshortened because of the time constraint. But what I have found in the autobiographical literature is that mothers are unable to support children and that child labour is associated with women working, and that both of them are associated with poverty. So it's not just nuclear households that come early to Britain. Male breadwinner families also come early, and that's associated with dependent wives and mothers. And of course, they become dependent, as I've described it, when men's earnings are not stable enough or secure enough and don't flow to families with sufficient reliability. And this creates what I've called breadwinner frailty, which is associated with Richard Smith's notion of nuclear hardship in making demands for a nascent welfare system. The conditionality of poor relief here is a very important element in my story. Child labour is part of less eligibility. Any family who is receiving poor relief has to provide its children to the labour market in the same way as the independent poor do, and perhaps even at younger ages. So that families' need for additional breadwinners is promoting children's work here. So conclusions. Well, you already heard that there's an upsurge in child labour in the 18th and 19th centuries. These changes have been interpreted in terms of the appearance of a new equilibrium with more and younger children working. I've related that new equilibrium to a variety of factors, some of which are exogenous, some of which are endogenous to the industrializing economy. And I hope I've provided a new synchronization between my story of child labour and the revisionist history of the Industrial Revolution. This is a regression analysis which pulls together this story in a quantitative way. I'm not intending to go through this. I never intended to. It's not that I've run out of time. I never intended to. But what I do want to say is that the quantitative material extracted from the autobiographies supports the story that I've told. So if you don't like the individual stories, you can actually buy the book and look at the hard numbers, but it's the same story. You can see, if you look at this regression result, the same U-shaped relationship between age at starting work and time. You can see the adverse effect of absent fathers on age at starting work. You can see the effect of larger SIB sets, more children in the household, on age at starting work, and so on. But my final thought leads me back to the voices, back to the accounts here from the autobiographies. I'm not an idiot, and I know that there are many people in this audience who will be skeptical of my source, frankly, dismissive of it. I'm sure you're saying to yourselves, well, what about the veracity of these autobiographies? You know, how representative are they? Well, the autobiographers themselves, although they said I might be muddled up about chronology here and there, the general truth of my account I would stand by. So these are men who stand by the general truth of their stories. And furthermore, they declare themselves often to be representative. Here's Will Thorne's own words, as he says, "With variations, my story is the story of hundreds of thousands of my East End neighbours and millions of my brothers all over the country." He metamorphosizes back into our archetype child worker. But whether you believe me or not, given my source, I hope that what I have done is haunted you. I hope that you will find it hard to forget Robert Collier as he remembered the exhaustion of those 13-hour days. And I hope that you will sometimes think of poor little William Arnold, lonely, cold little farm worker, weeping for his mother. And I know I think about Jonathan Savile foreseeing clearly and correctly how ill use and early work are going to lead to his own deformation as he becomes a cripple in the household of his master. For me, and I hope for some of you at least, these voices reek of authenticity and reinforce each other like the parts of a symphony, with variations, as Will Thorne said, summarizing the experience of a whole generation of children. And their sufferings, their stoicism, and their occasional childish pleasures put the humanity back into economic history and the trauma back into the Industrial Revolution. Thank you.
myself with many children of the same age standing at the spinning frames 13 hours a day.
In the winter of 1844, it was found necessary that my brother, John, and I should go to the pits. We had neither food nor shoes nor light in our first shift.
It was not long before I was taken to the coal pit. After working hard all day, I had to go 2 or 3 miles with picks to be sharpened or to spin at home till bedtime.
After the death of my mother, my brother was pressed on board a man-of-war. I felt myself alone in the wide world.
The dinner they gave me made the Sunday the greatest and happiest day of the week.